I keep returning to the line in the Book of Babylon where she talks about the shapes of hell are turned again to loveliness, and that's very much what I've found through the process of this. Like I found a deeper appreciation for all of the heresies of our history, all of the spirits that we encounter, whether they seem benefic or malefic. We as magicians are living in a very morally ambiguous space, and I wouldn't really have it any other way, because I think that is the human experience. And Lucifer points to the brightest and best aspects of this, but it also comes with a certain degree of darkness.
Ladies and gentlemen, do I have a special treat for you? The one and only Peter Gray, author, half of Scarlet Imprint, raconteur, all kinds of titles we can throw at this man, is joining us once again on the august occasion of the publication of 2019's most anticipated book, Lucifer Praxis. How are you doing, sir?
Doing very well. Doing great, Gordon.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the book. It's marvelous. Well done.
Thanks. Yeah, I just made it look easy.
Yeah. Well, you put in the hours. Let's say that.
Yeah. It's, as you know, when you're producing a magical book, these things have a time schedule that they work to, and come hell or high water, they do what they want to do. So it extracted its pound of flesh, but I'm really happy with the result.
Yeah, you should be. And I was thinking about that as I was arranging the questions for this call. Moments magnetize books, right? So I got to have Ani.Mystic come out in let's say a biopolitically significant moment. You get widespread civil unrest and legitimate and illegitimate rebellion, and the exploration of such. So even if the book kind of picks its own moment, because the moment picks the book, I think.
Yeah, I don't think I couldn't have anticipated the revolutionary moment that we find ourselves in now, and how terrifyingly relevant Lucifer and also the emergence of Lucifer is to that moment.
Yeah, agreed. One of the things I remember chatting to you about, I think from Cusco, and we'll start the conversation for realsies here, which is there actually aren't that many books of Lucifer. From a magical perspective, he gets name-checked in grimoires up and down the place, but in terms of books of Lucifer, not really that many, is there?
No, it's staggering what a hole there is in the field. I mean, you would assume that there would be more when you start to look into it. You think, oh, well, I'll read all the literature, I'll see what's out there. And Lucifer's been pretty much abandoned. Obviously, he's been picked up to a degree by some of the kind of second wave American Satanists, for better or worse. I don't want to criticize the practitioners who've been working in this field, because everyone's working at their own level in their own time. It can look a little bit like people were trying to find a point of difference from LaVeyan Satanism and were looking for another brand that they could adopt. But largely, I think we're in a position where the figure of Lucifer hasn't been overwritten to such an extent that you have to deal with a mass of misconceptions, because he's really been carried to us through the culture, and they're not on a scale where it can really alter that.
Yeah, the carried through the culture is something I want to pick up on in a bit, because before we get to, so I was thinking about this, right? The book is called Lucifer Praxis, but it's also Lucifer Praxis. So the existence of the book and the reading of the book, if you think about praxis being work, the book is kind of hyperdimensionally in the area that it covers already a form of praxis. Was that, did you discover that on the way? Does that make sense? Like, oh shit, it's Lucifer Praxis, but it's also Lucifer Praxis.
Yeah, I discovered it on the way. Yeah, I can't claim credit for that.
Very good. It's. I remember when you sent me the digital copy to have a look at a few months ago. My first thought was, oh, it's in the best possible way. It's exactly what I had expected it to be, because I remember with Princeps, even though we don't have that many books of Lucifer, which is good from a practitioner perspective, as you say, like you don't have to unpick before you sow. Like that's really good. But there are nevertheless, in the first book, you had to deal with like, oh, it's not the Roman god of light, and so on. And in this one, it's, well, what is this? What is it doing? What does this being bring to reality? And I've sat with this quite a bit myself. I remember having this conversation with you, that it's like an archetype of hyper individualism. Like its function in the cosmos is this like novelty and trajectory toward freedom, to kind of paraphrase Ursula Le Guin there. And it was, I don't know, very comforting is the wrong word, very validating and exciting to see that this is the story this is the current that's come through the book, I think.
Yeah, I mean, when I write all my books, I don't start with an end point. I see a lot of work that comes out that looks as if it's been written with the author having reached their conclusions before they begin. And a lot of the time that was spent in this book was working out what the story was, following the story, finding how to frame it, doing the work. I mean, it's such an organic process. I mean, the difference between what you and I do and what's done in the commercial trade is like night and day. I mean, the production of a book, the production of any piece of art. I mean, I know that there'll be people listening who like struggle to write a paragraph or a page or craft a blog post, but anyone who produces any finished piece of text knows quite how much invisible work there is behind it. So yeah, it's been a wild and illuminating journey, and one that surprised me as well as I tried to find the shape and the form and accurately trace the story and do credit to it.
Yeah, and it's, when I think about the arc of the two and a half books, really, if we include the two Antichrists in there, you've tracked an impulse. You've tracked an impulse through reality, which I think is magnificent. But one of the questions I wanted to do at the beginning, because there is nevertheless a theosophical, and even as I say this, in my head, there's a way I can make this true, but there's nevertheless a theosophically influenced view in esotericism of Lucifer as like the brother of Jesus and all these kind of things, and a certain kind of, oh, he was a good guy actually, which already submits or passes it through a morality that I don't think fits it particularly well. But the question is like, how would you explain Lucifer to a mixed New Age audience? We were just talking before we hit record about the Occulture conference you just got back from. So not that kind of audience, but let's say you get invited to something that's a bit more of a mix. There will be magical practitioners in the room, but also yoga practitioners and so on. How do we describe this impulse? What is Lucifer through these books?
A few moments later.
We just had to jump platforms there because of some gremlins on the line, but it cut out at a really, really good place, because I got to ask my question about how this impulse would be described to a mixed audience of not just occult practitioners, but people generally speaking esoterically. And Peter, over to you. How would we describe this impulse that you've tracked through 2.5 books?
Well, there are a couple of things to say. Firstly, do we want to describe it to everybody? I'm not sure that the work that's involved with Lucifer is really suitable for a general audience. Certainly the opportunity to approach Lucifer is open to everybody, but those who are chosen to do this kind of work, I think, are always going to be a fairly limited and select number. But if I want to pitch it and make it sound more approachable or understandable to a new age audience, then I think the best thing to do would be to say that Lucifer is the spirit of human freedom and the spirit of human potential, and that we're all moving towards a bright future, which Lucifer represents as the deified individual to some extent. But also Lucifer represents an approach to working with a whole angelic hierarchy. And the angels that we're talking about are those which are particularly interested in talking to and working with humans.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. I know what you mean about it not being something for everyone. But it was more like if we picture a conference that has, if there's any neo-pagans left in the world, for instance, they'll be like, oh, I don't do that Christian stuff is one option. Or two, it will be, oh, like this is just a Roman god of light. And it's like, no. Like this, and I think you did that really, really well, right? Which is, it is the spirit of human potential and innovation. And it is an invitation to angelic engagement. And that's quite important. That's actually a really powerful thing to track. But it's also why I think, coming back to there not being that many books of like Lucifer from a magical practitioner perspective, it's because this concept is so much bigger. And so in fact the practice of magic, which, I mean, you know this you're the guy who's like correctly pointing out that the origin story of witchcraft is the fall of the Watchers and so on. So there aren't books of Lucifer explicitly, and this is what's been so wonderful about reading Lucifer Praxis. It's because the impulse generates the books and the innovation and the move towards freedom in the conditions that it finds itself. How does that sound?
No, that sounds perfect, Gordon. It is that emergent property that when you look, you discover that it has been tracking through history. The teachings of the fallen angels have been given to us. They have been recorded. Why we're part of a long history of these kind of exchanges and discourses, and that we describe it in a particular way because of where we stand, and we all stand in relation to Christianity. And I think there are important conversations that we need to be having in terms of what we're proposing as being post-Christian rather than necessarily anti-Christian. And I think that's one of the big traps that practitioners have previously been drawn into, particularly when they've been living in very restrictive or perceived restrictive monotheistic cultures. It can be very difficult to have a conversation around these things. But I think this is what comes next, rather than simply something that's ancient or simply something that's always locked in a death struggle with Christianity.
Yeah, and that's quite important things, right? So almost by definition, a impulse towards freedom and innovation will have to look different in different conditions, rather than it being so the continuity is, it will always be transformative, which means it's actually a very challenging thing to be like, oh, it started here and it's the Roman god of light and we got all this stuff that didn't in fact happen. And in what I think is super interesting sitting with the book is this is a being that I want to say built itself over time, but that's not quite right. It emerged in our place-time conditions over time, reaching its apogee with Paradise Lost. Yes or yes?
Yes. 1,000,000%. I think that the critical impact of John Milton's work is still it hasn't been fully appreciated, partly because we're a culture which is losing its literacy, which doesn't understand that John Milton is the greatest was the greatest living English poet who transformed the English language, who transformed the culture and transformed the ways that we talk, see, think, believe. And Milton's been very neglected because firstly, he's a Puritan, so magicians initially hear that and they're like, well, why should I want to have anything to do with this guy? Not realizing that he wrote some of the most critical texts on for example, freedom of the press. Anyone who has any interest in any form of politics should have read the Areopagitica, which makes very cogent arguments for that. He also argued for the legitimacy of the execution of kings, which is what essentially got him into a lot of trouble. He argued for divorce laws to be liberalized, which was huge. And then very late in his life, without wishing to do the full Milton biography, blind, having served under Oliver Cromwell, having seen the revolution overthrown and the monarchy returning, decided to write the great English epic that he'd been training for since he was a child, that he'd been studying and reading and honing his mind and his language skills with, to produce this incredible channeled work, which is the first text in which Lucifer speaks, and speaks directly and speaks compellingly, and emerges as a great romantic hero erupting into the English imagination. But the tragedy for Milton personally is that he didn't realize the magnitude of the error that he'd made, because he sets out Paradise Lost as a series of choices, much like, a C.S. Lewis, for example, would. And we're meant to continually make the correct moral choices as we read it, and learn that we should not be we should not be listening to the teachings of the serpent. We should turn to Christ. But the difficulty that Milton has is that when he introduces his character, he's so fundamentally compelling and enchanting that once you've read the first two books and you've sympathized with this great fallen hero who rouses the shattered troops from hell, who are fighting an implacable and unbeatable opponent, you fall in love with Lucifer and everything else disintegrates around it. So it's a great Christian book, but it also, by its misreading and cross-reading, becomes the fundamental text for Luciferianism, and published notably in 1667, 1 year after the Great Fire of London, due to a lack of paper supplies. But Milton was late with his book as well. So
yeah, good point. Well, one of the things that I sit with, and it's sort of in reference to what you were saying before about this being, its function in the cosmos. I'm trying to say this right, because I've done a lot of work from a shadow work perspective, and actually at that fire pit out there, with different aspects of Lucifer being able to contain almost like training wheels for this legitimate rebellion. And it's very interesting to me that in Paradise Lost, he is sympathetic, but Milton, being Christian, doesn't actually shy away from, and he's running after it, admittedly, but doesn't actually shy away from, like, oh no, this is also, he's not a hero, but he's also not the bad guy. Like, this is a complex form that has a function in the cosmos. And I think about, we actually just finished up a shadow work container called The Shaman's Devil about this, and I went through my own Church of Satan inspired teenage phase. And that is psychologically to be expected given the conditions that I grew up in. And here is a being that can contain that for you until you essentially grow out of it. And it's not to say it's childish. It is childish, but it's childish in the way adolescence is childish. Like, you go through it. It's not a judgment to say that is wrong because you leave it. It's a developmental phase. And what I find so interesting about this being, and why there's a tendency to, if there is Luciferian books out there, they can be quite asinine, or they can be stuck in this teenage rebellious moment because people are still fighting with, what Kelly Brogan calls like mummy farmer and daddy government. Like, you're still reacting to, you're still in reaction rather than responsivity. And what I like about, obviously, other than the fact that I do think it represents the apogee of a 2,000-year ingress into our timeline in Paradise Lost, but the being is there in its complexity, and that's important. Like, it's not a, oh, Lucifer, turns out Lucifer is the good guy. It's like, that's not right. Do you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
a being that has a function. How does that sound?
Yeah, you're completely correct about that. I think if people come to Luciferianism or Satanism in a reactive way, it's very easy for them to get trapped in a form of arrested development. And I think it's very fair to say that occurs for a large majority of people, but certainly not all people. It's I don't want to dismiss people who are drawn to this figure in this material. And equally, I think what I wanted to do with the book was not lead them into like a trap, lead them into another system, lead them into a, well, here's a more lucid, academically verified Lucifer cult that you can slot yourself into. I wanted to keep the entire approach open. Like, I wanted this to be very open source so that people could form their own individual cult practice rather than being like mainlined into another replacement, because it would be easy to go, well, LaVey might have been valuable in his time for a certain group of individuals, and I think they had a lot of fun. But I'm not trying to introduce an update and say,
Yeah.
and now here's the next iteration. It's more open than that. We're in a different time to that.
And it has to be, if this is, amongst other things, an archangel of hyper individuality. Like, you, definitionally, you can you can invite people to experience the impulse, and what happens in relation to that being, then definitionally, it's going to be different on contact. That's what I was talking to you about this book when you sent me the digital copy in July. I'm like, this is exactly, one has been my experience of working with a being like this, but it's exactly what I wanted the book to be, because it must have been very tempting. It's because I know this as well. An occult book reading audience has certain things that it really likes in a book, and things that can, and it's like, okay, well, we'll have the preamble at the beginning, and then there's the ritual stuff, and then there's a shape to it. And this actually conforms to that shape if you know what you're reading, right?
Yeah.
And I was very, it's very gratifying, and this is what I mean by, like, it's the first kind of book of Lucifer that I've actually read that does a good job, obviously a good job, but like it can facilitate you meeting that current, that impulse. And yeah, well done.
Thank you. I mean, I want the reader and the ritualist to work with the book and to go through the different time depths, like to experience the spirit and the spirits at the different time depths with the different modalities of ritual practice, and have that experience grow within them as they learn and understand and make their own contacts. And then I think people gravitate to the kind of spirit work or the kind of magical work or even the kind of political work that they feel drawn to as a result of reading the book. You know, it's something which emerges, and it emerges with an acquisition of a series of skills.
Yeah. You write in the book a line that I think could be written in the sky or on pretty much any Scarlet Imprint book, which is, the challenge for practitioners is not process, but theology. And this is what we're speaking about here. Like, you, I get this. I'm remastering the Sigils course at the moment. So over the last 15 years, I've had hundreds of emails of people asking, for the right reasons, the wrong question. Like, can I use this kind of paper, or can I use this as a pen, or what if I don't burn it? And I'm like, the gold is not found in process. It's in what cosmos are you living in that allows these things to work. And Lucifer Praxis is like that. It's like, you could have written a book of invocations to Emperor Lucifer.
Yeah.
there are plenty of actually quite, I use them. There are plenty, a couple of, not plenty. There are like 3 or 4 quite good invocations to Emperor Lucifer extant in the grimoires. So we don't need that. The challenge isn't process, it's theology. What do you think to that?
I think there does need to be a lot of grappling with where we stand in a theological timeline, where all of our work stand in a theological timeline. And for me, that means I position myself as like, a post-Nietzschean, like post the French Revolution, where God and King are executed, and the previous construction of Europe and European identity and power structures guaranteed by an omniscient God was ended definitively, and we cannot go back to that. Although we will have a Christian revival, we will not return to that way of thinking. We've passed that historical moment. And so magicians have somewhat neglected that and found themselves still trapped in a very Yahwist, often unthinking approach in the way that they deal with and function with their spirits. And so I think there needs to be some hard thought about who we are and where we stand in relation to history and Christendom, and where we stand in relation to the spirits when we're calling and working with the spirits, what names of power we use, what approaches we use. And often that gets elided. And I think one of the reasons it gets elided is that the majority of the occult revival has occurred within America. America probably makes up 70% of the modern occult revival. And no shade on my American brothers and sisters, but they tend to follow rules a little bit more than perhaps we do in Europe, which sounds a little paradoxical. And I think it's because they're trying to construct culture. And one of the things that they do often is that they repeat diligently, which makes them very good students, but it can make them trapped in ways of thinking. And I hope that this book is one way that helps liberate them out of that. I'm waiting for the backlash. I'm waiting for the angry reviews from grimoire magicians, but
there's some good grimoire shit. Like the Parahedros thing is on my, I mean, the Southern Hemisphere obviously is on my summer to-do list. I think that actually explain, this is a really good example of what you were talking about with like the current or the impulse. So explain this Parahedros, why that's included and how it is part of this current.
Sure. So the Parahedros is the magical assistant, possesses many of the same powers that we would recognize in the grimoires, many of the same abilities and possibilities for work that we're looking for when we're, for example, going through grimoire catalogs, trying to understand and build our spirit team. And the Parahedros has this in spades. So this is a Greco-Roman ritual that I imagine would have been something that was available to one of our forebears, Simon Magus, in his work with Helena as the Sophia. And so I've recast the rite in a way that allows a modern practitioner to participate in a very old form of magic, the attraction of this spirit to come and dine with them, to descend as a star into a chamber and be feasted and greeted and conversed with. And I think it's a very powerful way of doing magic, this conversation with the spirit rather than necessarily the binding and constraint of the spirit, which is become very much the norm. And I think, as you know from your exposure to the traditions in Central and South America, like the feasting of these spirits that you see, in Kimbanda or the other traditions is much closer to some of the practices that we've also had in our past. Another reason that I like the Parahedros rite is that it prevents one of the problems with this kind of work, which is that it's very easy for people's egos to get wildly inflated when they're doing magic
Mm.
and work with deity in particular. And if you give people permission to become Lucifer, to take this spirit into themselves, you just create a lot of house fires. A lot of people blow up and go very, very badly wrong. Whereas I think the Parhedros relationship is an approach with less ego risk than some of the approaches that I could have taken.
I like that. That's, yeah. That hadn't necessarily occurred to me, but inflation with beings like this is absolutely, particularly a being of like hyper individuality is it's actually an operational hazard. You said something earlier that I want to double click on, which is to do with the romantics in particular, consciously, or let's just say semi-consciously, shepherding this being down through a century and a half, but like more than that because of the long shadow that they cast, right? So we can give them a couple of centuries. And this almost comes back to the theology rather than process in the how we conceive of poetry and the imaginal and creative expression in relation to magic and vice versa should, and this is something that Alan Moore is accidentally right about, should open up new ancestors of practice, new old ancestors of practice. And I really enjoyed following you and that current through exactly that, because if, as is correct, the imaginal is some kind of real, and you have these creatives, these artists, and I mean, I think of, because I studied Coleridge in end of high school, but I studied Coleridge, so I know what his visions of, I know what his experience and understanding of the imaginal is, and it's very similar to what ours would be. So you have this arc of people who are engaging with and inspired by, engaging with, grappling with, wrestling with this being. So, I mean, talk to me about that. Talk to me about how we and why we should incorporate the romantics as some kind of ancestors of practice.
Sure. Again, as I said with Milton, one of the problems is that we live in a society which isn't particularly literate. And sometimes I think it feels for all of us that we're the last people who read books or like understand the value of these things. But England has had this incredible prophetic line. And you see it in characters like Dee with his grand conception, which becomes empire. But there's a sense that England, standing against the Catholic Church, had the opportunity to make itself a seat of prophecy. So Jerusalem becomes displaced into England, and England becomes the seat of destiny in the world. And this is something that the poets felt as they made a New England. I mean, when Milton wrote Paradise Lost, he was creating modern English. I mean, once you've read Milton, you realize how much Milton there is that's been distributed through the culture, how much we are all the children of Milton. But the people who came after Milton, the Romantic poets, they took his terrible error and they ran with it. So we have Blake opening up the imaginal with the marriage of heaven and hell, and a whole series of incredibly powerful prophetic works, deliberately styled prophetic works. And Blake is running alongside at the same time as the Romantic poets, who are also drunk in the same way that, they're drunk on the trash literature of the time. So Shelley, for example, is like a kid who's obsessed with horror movies, and he grows up on this, but he also grows up as a magician. And I think this is something that the Academy have underplayed, and I think that it's something that practitioners haven't seen because they're not versed in the English poetic tradition. They don't know the story of these people. They don't know how radical they were, and they're so far removed from the language that it's very difficult for them to immediately get into it. But yeah, I think reading the book should give people a way into understanding how these experimental, wild, dangerous, poetic currents continue to push against everything, pushing against monarchy, pushing against government, fighting against tyranny. And to do so, they needed to find a figure who would exemplify that for them. And for Shelley, it was Lucifer, or to be slightly more accurate, a blend of Lucifer and Prometheus.
Yeah.
And they were looking for this. They were looking for this figure to emerge. They were looking for this. They were looking for this incursion, and the incursion's dramatic. If you read a poem like "Mask of Anarchy," like the king's men are hacking down the protesters, and they're about to run over a woman in the street, and Lucifer descends from the heavens and overthrows tyranny. And Shelley never says Lucifer, but he describes him in the precise terms that it can only be Lucifer. And what will be interesting over the next 10 years is that the poem ends famously with the "rise like lions after slumber." And this is already being quoted approvingly by Christians and street protests in England. And so Shelley will return to people's consciousness, as will William Blake. And so we will find ourselves very much in their shadows.
Definitely. One of the things, speaking of William Blake, I didn't realize just how many contact points he had with Swedenborg and Swedenborgianism. Like his parents were in a Swedenborg adjacent church, and he spent 11 years, according to your book, and I didn't know this part about his childhood, like in his art training, 11 years with a mentor who was Swedenborgian.
Yeah.
That for me is huge, because you mentioned in the book, but I'm very interested. Swedenborg, I think you characterize him correctly. Like, you actually don't need to read him because it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
It's like you're reading Swedenborgians is useful. The people who could be bothered combing through the fever dreams and building a cosmovision out of it is useful. But he has this idea which is extremely animist, which is influx. And an influx is essentially the porosity of the human mind, so that we almost don't have any original thoughts, but we are like a reef of the movement of the spirit world, and the movement of the spirit world through us is what we experience as thoughts and visions and dreams. And so for him, the mind, the human mind, is very porous, and that's a very, animist idea. And I think about the fact that was what Blake was marinating in as a child, and that was a huge unlock for me.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, there's been some good work done on it. It's a friendship. There's a book precisely on the Swedenborg thing. Friendship's in the title.
Fair enough.
Opposition is true. Opposition is true friendship.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Which is, the thing that I really enjoy. This is, again, it's like not quite animist, but it's pre-Hegelian or something. Blake, and I credit, and this is a weird way, but maybe you'll agree with me, maybe you won't. I think if you marinate in Swedenborg without onboarding the worldview, you can in fact arrive at a very sophisticated metaphysics of polarity. Because actually, one of the good things about Swedenborg is in his own lurid tours of heaven and hell, he has a functional view of the demonic, in the sense that demons are still in service to the betterment of the cosmos. And opposition is true friendship is just like possibly the best line ever in English to describe the ecosystemic function of Lucifer in a cosmos, as far as I'm concerned. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, great. That's perfect. And people should also, if I'm going to insist on people reading these kind of texts, Blake is very easy to read. Like Marriage of Heaven and Hell is an extremely approachable text for people. And I think that everyone should have read that and Songs of Innocence and Experience at the very least. These are simple poetry books with great insight that you don't need to be an incredible specialist to understand. Because as you say, like Blake marinated in Swedenborg, he grew up singing Moravian hymns. So a lot of his work there is very, 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 very sing-song and easy to approach and wise and challenging and witty and brilliant and insightful. I think everyone should read William Blake. But they will struggle. They will struggle with the prophetic works. The prophetic works are a different game.
I've only read the easy stuff, and did those feet, right? Like, only read the easy stuff, which is why it was super interesting. But it comes back to this idea of ancestors of practice, because here is a kid who obviously, I presume, would have had some fairly vivid dreams as a child. His parents have introduced him to a Moravian view or a Moravian version of Christianity. He's tutored in art, so creative expression, although admittedly not super creative, by a Swedenborgian. And as you said, and this is another unlock for me, which is really, really helpful, Dee's principal methodology of scrying, let's say, is prayer. And so was Blake. So at what point do you call Blake a magician, right?
Yeah.
Tutored by a Swedenborgian, using prayer to generate visions of a cosmos and insights into reality. At what point do we move him across into a different column?
He'd be so furious with that.
I know.
But we're magicians, so we can slyly move him over. Yeah. Blake suggests a lot of things to us, but ultimately his worldview is opposed to ours. But he's a phenomenal example, and I think everyone should read Blake. But
I don't, and I know you're the same as this. I don't care if I'm not in alignment with, I mean, because I read, not often, but I will use medieval Arab astrologers' work. I am not in alignment with their worldview. I don't care. Like,
Yeah.
and the same thing with Blake. It was really interesting because it never really occurred to me that the infinity in a wildflower guy was actually so anti-nature by the end of his life. But there's not. But here is someone who is actually doing the work and having, and this is why I think he shows up so strongly in a Lucifer book. It's like he carved his own path. And that's the bit that we should find alignment with, rather than like, oh, Blake accurately described a magical reality.
Yeah. And the magic and art thing is fairly clear and strong. Like, magicians are often bringing back and creating these magical artifacts. It's as culture creators, I think that's something that we also need to be stepping into a little bit more than we have.
Yeah, especially at the moment, because one of the things that I've been very interested in these past few years is we do get a resurgent, it's happening, like the resurgent Christianity. And I've been talking about not ceding that ground, because when we do, you just cede it to dank psychopaths, basically. But Shelley was quite interested in retaining the aspects of the Christ current that hadn't been ruined by the accretion of like 1800 years of theofascism, right? Like a theistic fascism, which is the Holy Roman Church and what have you. And that's always been my kind of view, right? Which is like, no, you don't get to have all you don't get to keep all the jewels just because you say so. And that, I think, that's, funnily enough, quite Luciferian. And we come back to its role in the cosmos. But I guess speak a little bit about that, what Shelley, how the parts of Christ that Shelley retained, I suppose, and why, and sort of where the lesson is for practitioners today in a similar approach.
Well, Shelley started off as a virulent atheist, and the reason he was thrown out of university is he wrote a letter and distributed it to all the bishops and colleges, arguing for atheism, and caused a terrible flap. Shelley's a funny character. He's very gentle. We see that very in the version of Shelley who's left us by Mary Shelley after his death. She presents the soft and the yielding Shelley to people, and he often dressed in quite a kind of boyish fashion. However, Shelley was also very dark as an individual. He created phenomena around him on a consistent level. So people saw doppelgangers of Shelley. There were several instances where that happened. There were various phenomena that occurred around him. And Shelley kind of veered between the Luciferian and the more Promethean, and a little bit of a dash of the Christian, but his was very much an emergent and a spiritual struggle that he was going through with all of these ideas.
Mm. I think we're experiencing the ultimate, in the next couple of years, conclusion or culmination of attempting to live without shared story.
Mm.
And this, I think, is there, like, if you imbalance the revolutionary impulse, you do end up with Sovietism. You do end up with, like, nightmares, right?
Yeah.
If you go too far into technocratic, managerial, positivist atheism, and that is ultimately not Lucifer's fault. And one of the things that I thought I enjoyed in your characterization of Shelley there is, even if he wouldn't have articulated it that way because he didn't get to see Sovietism and technocracy and so on. But there's like a, hang on a minute, there are parts of this that don't belong to tyranny. There are parts of this that belong to the cosmos. And this is one of the, I think, the great medicines of approaching Lucifer as legitimate rebellion, is it is permanently in rebellion to tyranny, but that looks different as that eternal battle kind of tumbles through history. And it's really in him kind of keeping a hold of some of that stuff. That's his moment in time's understanding, like, wait a minute, there are some things that we're experiencing now at the fourth turning that is like, hang on, probably there's some things that we should revalue as we go through this moment.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the fight against tyranny is the central message that carries through them. I mean, Shelley is politically naive, inevitably, given his extremely privileged upbringing, but also given the crazy left-wing influences that he was under. I mean, he wasn't a solutions person, but he's also someone who literally spent his money on giving blankets to the poor. I mean, he had that in his character as well. And he would also run out on bills all the time. So he both aided the poor and did a runner on significant,
but also ruined
bills.
small businesses. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Let's operationalize this then. for practitioners today, let's operationalize this story across these 2.5 books. And because what I find reading them is, and in particular Praxis, because it's front of mind and sort of been where my my soul and spirit have been at for a while, is, let me see how this sounds. Reading these books, and I haven't done Paradros, but I will. But I have certainly done Lucifer work and angel work and so on. But coming back to invocations or spirit work under the umbrella of Emperor Lucifer will hit different after reading these books. So let's operationalize what you, because this is always the author's, like, this is not at all the author's purview, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What do you want out of practitioners for reading this book? Let's operationalize the story a bit.
I want them to find what speaks to them in the text and to pursue that practice. But I want them to do that by trying practices that they haven't considered before. Ideally, I would like people to work from the deepest time depths and an understanding of the angels of the Principate, by which I mean the angels that we encounter in the sublunary world. And then I'd like them to move through the different levels of encounter with the spirit of Lucifer as he emerges from that point, and then to be able to craft their own practice from it. Like there are stacks of rituals in there, and with all of these things, it depends on your personal approach. It depends on what your magical needs are. It depends on whether you're working alone or whether you're working with other people. I mean, there are a million ways that this can go, but what I'd like it to do is the same thing that apocalyptic witchcraft did, which is, once I've written it and it's out there, it belongs to the people who do the work. Like the tradition belongs to them. So I'd love to see this work flourishing in small groups, individuals, over time, in the way that I've seen that happen with my other works. No, I really want to let this loose in the world and see where it takes people, see what's required. Because, as you say, you know, it is about the fight against tyranny, and people are seeing what that tyranny is in diametrically opposed ways at present. Like we're entering into an extremely stormy time. And I think people could read this text on the political left, people could read this text on the political right, people could read this text with no politics whatsoever other than their own personal relationships, and have completely different experiences. And that's intentional. Like this book is open because it's the contact with spirit which will fill these things.
It occurs to me that it works from the level of armchair practitioner up, because you can read this book and on board the Lucifer as quote unquote just the archetype of legitimate rebellion. So you can sit with the romantics and be like, oh, this is the impulse inside of me that does not find acceptable tyrannical or restrictive conditions, and not in a childish tantrum way, but like, no, this is unacceptable. I decline. I refuse. And you can actually, quote unquote, just, because the imaginal Lucifer spirit world, be in relation, in companionship with this being, when you go, this is the archangel of legitimate rebellion. And it almost stacks up from, you can armchair it to, at the, I don't know if it's a peak, this seems a little bit unfair, but if you are actually like a grimoire practitioner and you're like, oh no, but I am also rather desirous of getting better at calling up spirits, then this process, like onboarding it into your mind, makes the calling up in the name of Emperor Lucifer hit different. So I really like that. I really like that. I see what you mean about, you want apocalyptic witchcraft landed in places in culture that was outside of witchcraft.
Mm.
And this can do, because I can't think of anyone who shouldn't read this. Does that make sense? Like I
Yeah.
don't think there's, if you are understanding my words because I'm speaking English, this story is part of your inheritance wherever you happen to be in the world and whatever your practice happens to be. Like it's tracing a expression through culture that you probably should know more about. And so I'm very interested in how you, in your heart, you would like to see that operationalized.
Yeah. I think it has the potential to revolutionize the way that people approach their magical practice. I think it can transform people. I'm convinced that it can, because it should be able to take people from a level of raw contact to developing the necessary skills for them to be able to have these experiences in quite elaborate fashions, and then stripping it all back down again and understanding that it's us and the weather and the people around us, the gods and the forces of the heavens, the things that we interact with. And I think for people to go through that journey, I think it could do them a lot of good.
For sure. That occurred suddenly. You mentioned the Prisca Theologia of Ficino and others in the book. And it's long been my take that the Prisca Theologia is magic, right? Like, and so these beings and these processes belong to that. It belongs to a superstructure that at certain millennia in history, parts of it will express through Christianity, but otherwise not. And this being belongs up there, right? Which means you, as any kind of practitioner, it doesn't mean you read this book and you have to become a Luciferian, whatever that means. It's this is a colleague in the magical cosmos.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the project that you've been engaged with animism is very similar to my understanding that most of the spirit structures that we had were kind of collapsed into their own footprint, and that we've been living in a world where we've had this ridiculously reductionist, dualist way of looking at things. There is good and there is evil. There's the legitimate spirits, and then there are illegitimate spirits. And the ecology is much more complex than that. It's a much more entangled, confusing, wild world that we find ourselves moving in. And the book should make people uncomfortable. I mean, working on it, I can remember Alcestis kind of looking at me and going, is this evil? Should we be doing this? Have we, is this the right thing to do? And I think you have to confront these ambiguities. You have to confront these difficulties in order to come through the process. And I keep returning to the line in the Book of Babylon where she talks about the shapes of hell are turned again to loveliness. And that's very much what I've found through the process of this. Like, I found a deeper appreciation for all of the heresies of our history, all of the spirits that we encounter, whether they seem benefic or malefic. We as magicians are living in a very morally ambiguous space, and I wouldn't really have it any other way, because I think that is the human experience. And Lucifer points to the brightest and best aspects of this, but it also comes with a certain degree of darkness.
One of the things that I think that's completely correct, and I'll tell you why. So at different points in the church's history, Mary was forbidden. So the Mary cult was rebellious to start with. And even inside the church, so you think about during the Soviet era, the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe was basically on the side of the good guys, right? Because it was in resistance to Sovietism. Fast forward to its pedophile bank era, and it's a bad guy again. And this, speaking about the moral ambiguity and this Lucifer as a being belonging to the superstructure, means that it is the governing spirit of, at times, the mother of God, and at times is on the side of the church, and at times isn't. And that's the being that I think you see in emerging in this book. And one of the things that occurred to me, because I love this idea, and it sort of came up in the Shaman's Devil recently, is in the early days of folklore, comparative mythology, and anthropology, 1800s, early 20th century, it became evident that Lucifer, quote unquote, was a trickster in this cosmology. Like when you're in an anthropological frame 140 years ago, and you go and look at a different civilization, you look for different things. You look for a mother and a father and like a trickster and whatever. Yeah. And the thing is, that's how to say this. The way they describe it is wrong, but they are accurately describing the nature of the being at the level of the superstructure, that rather than abandon us inside this 2,000-year project, has deigned to play that function in the form that we can approach it as now, which is Lucifer. So it's not to say that Lucifer is identical to Kokopelli and to wherever you want to find tricksters around the world. It's not that. It's that in the conditions of reality that have been the last 2,000 years of like European history, let's say, it either shows up as nothing or it shows up as this. And it's been really interesting. That was my like, oh shit, Peter and I have met the same being, right? Yeah. Because like you track like, oh, here is how it moved through civilization and revealed itself to us in the way that the conditions of reality could allow, ultimately going full nude, I guess, in Paradise Lost. But I don't know. What do you think to that? Like, it's really interesting because it's asinine to say that Lucifer is a trickster if you approach it on that almost materialist 140-year-old anthropological frame. But if you jump up to the Prisca Theologia, not really. Then it's kind of true again, right?
Yeah. No, I fundamentally agree. It is that god of magic kind of like trickster aspect that we've had with us, since before we were human. This is, one iteration of the book when I was like working on it, I was thinking, do I need to start with fire?
Exactly.
Do I need to begin the book with fire? Do I need to begin the book with this earliest layer of becoming human? Because it's there.
It is that I mean, we've had a very similar conversation about 15 years ago in Soho, because that was the challenge with Star.Ships was like, how far fucking back do you have to go? Because these are 100,000-year-old beings that will show up out of love, essentially, in a form that is built of the conditions that we are in at the moment. So you absolutely could have started with fire. I totally get that book. Like that would have leaned more on the, I'm going to tip a bit more Prometheus in and tell the story that way.
Yeah.
But you went more Lucifer. I see that decision point, actually. I see like, I start with fire and basically tell the story so that it's 60-40, almost like more Prometheus, which would still be a true telling, but is not this telling.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and this is how everyone's individual genius will tell the stories to themselves. I mean, this is how we experience life. This is the great thing about magicians. I don't I don't have to worry too much about the book, because the people who are drawn to it will be the people who are aware of that. They're driven and self-actualizing, and they're becoming these many different things rather than just cookie cutter slaves.
No, very cool. All right. Well, I like I said, remarkable book. Very, very much worth the wait. Is there any parting advice or suggestions to people as to how to approach it, or anything as we draw the curtains?
Well, I think like all books, and all authors, I'd like people to give it their full attention. It is a kind of book that might carry you away, so you may well find that you read it in one or two sittings initially. But then I want you to pause and take some time and go back and actually do the practices. I'd like people to go through that process, to read and reread, and to take the pieces from it which inspire them, and to find the pieces which give them the connection with the spirit, and to lean more deeply into those. And it really doesn't matter what I say, because the moment historical that this book has dropped into is going to create a resurgent Luciferianism, which is an heir to the great prophetic and romantic tradition of the English writers, but is also becoming something which is very much our own as we move into, whatever the next 20 years of hell are going to be in the world. And I think during those years of hell, having your eye and your heart fixed on the spirit of liberation and freedom and resistance to tyranny may be one way that you get through it.
Love it. All right, sir. Amazing chat. Once again, congratulations on the book. I would just second the take time with it and definitely come back to it. A book that just states this book is geologically deep, right? There are layers upon layers, so keep going back to it. And I've read it a couple of times now because I got the digital copy, and you forget stuff. And I don't mean like, oh yeah, I mean like I wasn't paying it because it takes you away. Like there's an important part in a chapter or a paragraph that I'm like, I definitely read this, but somehow it's new. So yes, spend some time with the book. It's very well done.
No, thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Gordon. It's a pleasure to talk to you about it, and to talk to the ever erudite Rune Soup audience about it as well.